Jeg håper du hadde en interessant og lærerik dag i går, og ikke minst kveld. Jeg vet ikke hva dere gjorde, om dere var på utseksjonfest, eller om dere sparer det til kveldens fest på Rockefeller. Men først så skal vi møte en professor fra England og en kvinne fra Danmark. Ingen av de sitter askefast, og det er jeg veldig glad for. For jeg gleder meg veldig til å høre begge to. Det blir i hvert fall da 2 forelesninger nå. Vi skal ha en lang forelesning, og så blir det en pause. Og så skal vi ha en forelesning igjen, og så blir det en ny pause. Og etter det så blir det jo da masse ekskursjoner, som jeg regner med at dere ser frem til. Da går jeg over til engelsk, for jeg må introdusere vår gjest fra Wales. Despite volcanic ashes and plane chaos, he managed to land in Norway yesterday evening. He's a professor of European Youth Policy at the University of Glamorgan in Wales. The title of his lecture is Street-Based Youth Work and Social Inclusion of Young People. Please welcome Howard Williamson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hate these things, so I'm not going to stand there. Just getting organized. Psychologically, it's been very difficult to tune myself into coming here. Thank you for listening to the English language. I understand I'm the only person not from the Nordic communities who's turned up. I did receive an SMS from Reykjavik from a friend of mine, Jon Sigmarsson, who said Gordon Brown asked for cash from Iceland, but there's no C in the Icelandic language, so they sent him ash instead. And Henning asked me to speak to you as long ago as last August. I put it into my calendar and was looking forward very much to coming to Norway again. I've been here many times before to speak to your political party conferences, to do youth work events. I actually did a youth policy review of Norway in 2004 and had a number of arguments about multi-systemic therapy and the age of criminal responsibility in your country. Some of my ideas went down like a lead balloon, as you can imagine. In a tolerant country that you are, but a country that is changing dramatically, particularly here in the capital, not so much in other parts, and therefore new challenges are arising. Anyway, psychologically I was tuned into coming here, and then on Monday it looked like I was not going to get here, so I started to make plans about having 3 days off. And then they reinstated the flights. The other problem was that I live in the Welsh coal mining valleys, which is quite a difficult place to come from to get anywhere, and I nearly always fly to Amsterdam, and then it's easy. So KLM to Amsterdam, and then wherever. But I had a meeting of something called the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, which is an award for young people, founded by the Queen's husband. It was the Queen's birthday yesterday, incidentally, but Queen of England's birthday. And Prince Philip founded this award in 1956, and it's got a little committee of trustees, most of whom are multi-millionaire entrepreneur businessmen, men. And there's a few explorers on it, and me as the sort of policy person. And we had a meeting scheduled yesterday morning, so I arranged my flight to come here from London. And then the meeting yesterday morning in Windsor was cancelled because most of the other trustees, 3 of them are stranded in Spitsbergen. Prince Edward is stranded in New York, and another colleague was stranded in Australia. So that was cancelled, and suddenly I'm thinking, I hope my flight to Oslo is cancelled, because otherwise I've got to go to London, which is a 3.5 hour, 4 hour, maybe 5 hour journey for me from South Wales, depending on the reliability of British trains, which are pretty appalling, as some of you may know. So anyway, I set off at 10 o'clock yesterday morning, and I got here at 11:15 last night, which makes it quite difficult to stand in front of you today, not because I'm tired, but because I don't have any sense of who you are and what you did yesterday. And I was saying over breakfast to Henning that I hate myself when I can't sit in for a little while. And even if I cannot understand anything you're talking about, I can pick up the atmosphere. I can start to soak up the feeling in the room and then tune what I'm going to say a little bit to that. I certainly sat through a whole day of Norwegian in Buda last summer, and everybody said, "You must be mad. Could you understand anything?" And I said, "Absolutely nothing." But at least I was sitting there and showing an interest in what you were doing. And I think the following morning, when I got the lousy slot of 9 o'clock in the morning after everybody had been on the piss all night, typically pick on the foreigner to pick up the graveyard slot, I think it stood me in quite good stead. So let's see where we go from here. I know that at this event you've had Graham Tiffany and Tony Jeffs before, and two people I know pretty well. I was at a meeting in Bristol a couple of weeks ago, and one of the people at the meeting was a guy called Richard Pring, who was a terribly, terribly distinguished, retired Oxford professor of education. And Richard has led a very, very long-term review of education for 14 to 19-year-olds in the UK. Over the last 6 years, he's 72 years old, running a marathon in a couple of weeks' time, a very interesting, dynamic character. And he said, out of the blue at this meeting, he said, and of course, detached youth work is critically important for young people's development and education. And I said, where the hell did you get that one from, Richard? And he said, well, we had Graham Tiffany as one of our core members of our core group. And I said, yeah, but Graham is the intellectual guru of street-based work in the UK. A good man and a great thinker. But if you ask most street-based youth workers why they do what they do, most of them would not be able to articulate it in the same kind of ways that Graham does about democratic education and so on and so forth. And Tony Jeffs is a bit the same. Tony is the guru of youth work practice in the United Kingdom, but Tony's never done a day's work as a youth worker. Tony wouldn't, I once said to somebody else, and maybe I could apply it to Tony as well, that he wouldn't recognize a disaffected youth if they head-butted him in the face. I said that to one of Tony Blair's policy advisors on youth policy in 1997. So I probably make myself few friends when I say we have to be a little bit cautious about over-celebrating street-based youth work. And I come to that as a professional qualified youth worker myself, somebody who ran a youth centre for 25 years, who has been in practical youth work for 40-odd years, has been in youth research, sometimes looking at youth work and sometimes looking at wider issues for 30-odd years, and having been, I suppose, quite an influential British government advisor and advisor to other governments for about the last 20 years, not just on something we call youth work, that the French call la vie associative and other people call something different. And incidentally, there's a big conference in July under the Belgian EU presidency, which will be the first European Youth Work Convention. And I'm closely involved in that and trying to develop that. And it's part of a process of trying to get a documentary record of the histories, not the history, the histories of youth work in Europe. Because, in Norway, as I understand it, your conception of youth work largely, not you guys here today, but largely is the self-directed autonomous youth organization, which receives its funding through the ministry according to its membership and really does its own thing. And it's part of the kind of formation of young people in a genuinely democratic society. But of course, youth work was also something under the Nazis, the Hitler Youth. Youth work was something under the communists, under the Komsomol. Youth work in Germany, the Wandervogel, was something about young people disappearing into the mountains and discovering themselves and doing nothing in terms of connecting with the social. And then youth work in my country and some of the old British colonial outposts like Cyprus and Malta. Youth work is the professional worker leading perhaps a team with volunteers and part-time workers, maybe club-based work, but intervening in the lives of young people in certain ways. So I'm going to make a few errors because I'm going to be suddenly implicitly talking about forms of youth work that may not necessarily resonate with some of you. And I'm very happy to be criticized and taken to task if I do that. Interestingly, when Henning invited me, I had just read, as an academic, I had just read a paper being submitted to a Dutch journal on social inclusion called The Romantic Ethic in Detached Work. One of you might have written it, because it certainly came from Norway, but I guess it was an academic rather than a practitioner. If there's some academics here, you may have written it. But it was really about what do these people called detached youth workers actually do? And it is the huge central question that British policymakers are also asking youth workers generally and detached youth workers in particular, because detached youth work is seen as this kind of secret society. Whose phone's that? I used to say feed your Tamagotchi, but I realize nobody knows what Tamagotchis are anymore. So they're often considered to be private clubs, closed shops. You know, we have this special relationship with young people, and we're not going to tell you how we do it. And in this article about Norway, and it was interesting that it was about Norway, the researchers observed detached youth workers going into certain kinds of semi-public space, shopping centres, and places like that, and seeing a group of their kids on the other side of the shopping centre, and then making a decision as to whether to approach them, say hello. This would be on a Saturday morning or something like that. What was the rhyme and reason and the rationale for the contact making or the not contact making in particular circumstances? And I thought it was a kind of a very interesting article, because the journal that it was submitted to is desperately attempting to produce information on what youth workers actually do, not what Howard Williamson, Graham Tiffany, or Tony Jeffs proclaims that they do, because those are two often very different things. I often give a talk when it's specifically about youth work called Sacred Cows or Cherished Values. Now, English expressions, but you've probably got similar ones. Are these special principles of youth work important for the 21st century or not? Should we kill them off and rewrite the book, the manual about youth work values and principles? Or should we defend them to the hilt and resign if governments and authorities try to tell us to do it differently? And street-based youth work, in one sense, is at the forefront, the vanguard of some of that debate. Because in my country, and I'm sure it's the same in, certainly is the same in Sweden, it probably is the same in Norway, maybe not quite the same in Denmark, I'm not sure. Certainly moving in that direction in Finland. The authorities, the finances, the people who control the budget are increasingly making demands on plans and programs and outcomes and indicators and measures and all those sorts of things. And there are certain professional groups, Henning and I were talking about alcohol and drug services, and certainly a lot of those community-based services are also struggling with issues about how do they represent and display accountability for their work with public resources in ways that remain true to their particular ways of practice, but also keep the money flowing in their direction. Right. Now, I usually carry around a bit of paper. I haven't got it with me this time, called PowerPointless. Because I'm doing the usual thing, talking away, and then realizing I've got some slides and I've forgotten to move them on. At least I promise you I won't be doing two things that PowerPoint people tend to do. One is turning around and reading what you can read anyway. And the second is putting up so much stuff on the screen that you're thinking, I can't read any of that. So I hope that you'll be able to make some sense of it. Right. Okay. I think I sit on a drug, just by chance, I sit on a drugs committee in Wales for the Welsh Government. They're called the Advisory Panel on Substance Misuse, which is like the Welsh equivalent of the English Advisory Council on Drug Misuse, which has been dealing with all this stuff about methadone, which I'm sure some of you have picked up. I was arguing, why the hell are we going to criminalize methadone? Because within days, some Chinese outfit is going to produce another chemically manufactured parallel to ecstasy or something else. And sure enough, MDAI is now the new one that's on the market, £10 on the internet. Currently legal, and it will kind of roll on. But we had a meeting of one of these committees a couple of weeks ago, and this woman came to talk about alcohol and drugs issues in further education. And she talked for 20 minutes about quality standards, performance indicators, action plans. You're good at action plans in Norway, I know. So, a whole load of kind of systemic things. And after 20 minutes, I still had not one single clue about what the drug and alcohol issues were affecting young people in further education in Wales. I actually asked the opening question, provocatively. I said, we know they're not heroin addicts and crack cocaine addicts, because if they were, they wouldn't be in studying at all. What's the profile of their boozing and their drug taking? Are they getting absolutely pissed on Friday nights and Saturday nights, which is my knowledge of young people in the area she was talking about, and then sorting themselves out on Sunday and returning to learning on Monday? And I said, and if that's the case, then there's one set of issues. But if it's something else, if they're all taking stimulants to keep themselves awake because they're so paranoid about their parental pressure to succeed in education, then that's another issue. And she hadn't got a clue. So here she is, the national expert on substance misuse in further education, who can't tell me one single thing on substance misuse in further education. But she can describe to me all the frameworks, government policies, standards, and so on and so forth. And I think it's crucial, and I don't really need to be saying this to you, that we have to go back to first principle and say, which young people are we talking about? And of course, in street-based youth work, the sort of kids that you are talking about, the ones that you are making links with, I don't need to read this out and go through it in detail, are your ones who are likely to have been excluded or self-excluded themselves from learning, from training. They may have difficult family relationships. They may be dabbling in substance misuse. They may be on the edges of offending behavior. I don't want to stereotype them. They're certainly not all like that. Indeed, 15 years ago, I was trying to tell the Ministry of Justice in London that the vast majority of young people hanging around on the streets are fairly ordinary young citizens. Just they haven't got anywhere else to go. And do we want to spend our lives setting the police on them and criminalizing them for playing music too loud, drinking a tad too much alcohol in public space? Or do we want to really distinguish between the really troublesome groups on the street, where criminal justice measures are important, and the very ordinary kids on the street, perhaps 80% of them, who actually need support, intervention, discussion, provision, opportunity? So, as I said, I don't want to tar them all with a kind of negativity. But many of them are young people who have perhaps given up in the modern world. Perhaps not so much in Norway, but it'll come with your, I can't remember what the figures were a few years ago, 6,000 people coming into Norway from 100 different countries every year, from Eastern Europe, from Africa, and other parts of the world. You will have a multicultural mix, and I know you've had presentations on that, and yet you have constructed a society where family and schooling and community critically work together positively to bring your young people into positive relations with the wider society, but many of those other people have not inherited that culture. So will have huge challenges. And one of my points that made me very unpopular with your government in 2004 was about language learning. I made the point that if Norwegian education is premised critically upon families being able to support the learning that already goes on in schools, then many immigrant families are not able to provide that support. And if they cannot provide that because they don't have the language, if they don't have the language and therefore cannot provide that support, then you are, by your liberal, tolerant policies, disadvantaging the children within those families, who ultimately will come out at age 15 into the adult criminal justice system, or age 16, 17, 18 into the marginalized positions in the labor market. So there are some issues there. The point I'm making is that the kids we encounter through street-based youth work tend to be those who are positioned in some way, not being judgmental, on the edge of where we would like them to be. And psychologically and socially and economically. They are often quite dispirited and demoralized about what the future holds. And one of my lectures on substance misuse tends to be, why do young people take drugs if they're all bad for you? Well, they wouldn't take them if they're all bad for them, would they? They'd take them, there must be something good about them in certain contexts. But some young people take drugs because they don't think the future holds any promise at all. Blot out the future, live for today. And other young people take drugs to escape from the pressures of today. And they may take the same drugs in the same places, but they do it for very different reasons. So we have to sort of get into the heads of young people to think about what their perspectives are on the world that they live in. And critically, this issue of motivation to change. And again, I draw from the addictions field here about cycles of change, and I will return to that. So that's the young people. In terms of the youth work practice, I don't want to dwell on this because if you've listened to Graham and Tony, you will have heard all of the British theory, and I'm sure you've got I've listened to plenty of people from your Nordic countries, including Iceland, about the sort of philosophies and principles of the kind of youth work that many of you are engaged in. Non-threatening, conversational, dialogical, those kinds of things. And building agendas on the terms of the young people you encounter, not on the agendas of the policymakers and the funders. I think, and of course I'm being a devil's advocate to you today, but because I believe in the work that you do, and I have done it myself over many years. Often it's the first step, it's the first renewal of contact with young people to give them belief that they can go somewhere in their lives. So there are those kinds of things that start to shift attitudes, expectations, aspirations, and so on and so forth. But probably the bit that I ought to be talking a bit more to you about is this stuff about social exclusion. One or two of you may know that one of the first things Tony Blair did when he became the Prime Minister of the UK, and I remember going to Germany and talking about Blair's ideas for Schroeder, and coming to Oslo and talking to the SV Party conference in 1997 about what Blair was going to do for young people about social inclusion. And he set up this social exclusion unit, and I was very closely involved with that and the work it did around policies for the re-engagement of disadvantaged and disengaged young people. But what is social exclusion? And again, it's probably very difficult for some of you to grasp the kinds of exclusionary processes that prevail in my country, because they have not necessarily hit Norway as dramatically as some other parts of Europe. But I think in time it may well come. It may not, and I hope it doesn't, and I hope your policies and your politics and your philosophies will prevent the worst excesses of these things happening. But I was reading a newspaper article on Sunday, and interestingly, in the business pages, which I do look at, I don't enjoy them very much, but I do read them, on one page there was a little map of the 8 most deprived areas in the United Kingdom. And paradoxically, turn the page over, it was about executive pay and how certain chief executives of big companies in the United Kingdom had bonus payments from somewhere between 20 and 90 million pounds a year. And here I was on the other page looking at the 8 most deprived areas in the UK, 4 of which are near me, 1 of which I live in, where 27% of the population are in receipt of public benefits. And it's not just about income poverty, it's about being excluded from all kinds of other opportunities and possibilities. The second point is that these things fuel each other. I met a girl in the supermarket the other day, Lisa, who used to be my next door neighbour. She was with her husband on a real flashy motorbike. There they were, colour-coded helmets, jackets. The bike was outside, yellow, red, and black. And Lisa said to me, "You made all the difference in my life," to me. Not because I was a detached youth worker, I was the next door neighbour. But her mum had mental health problems all her life. Her dad was made redundant in 1985 after the miners' strike and never ever worked again. And so long as he had £60 a week for beer, she could have the rest. His wife could have the rest for food and rent and TV license and things like that. So how did he get £60 a week on unemployment benefit? Because he worked illegally. Did a bit of driving, did a bit of this, did a bit of that. And the 2 kids struggled along with nothing, absolutely nothing, cut off from every kind of opportunity in school trips, and so on. So I saw this kind of notion of social exclusion over the wall firsthand. The reason Lisa said that I made the difference was when her mum leaned over the wall and said, "She's only got 7 A's and 2 B's, age 13 at school." I said, "But Anna, that's great. It's not good enough. She's still got 2 B's. I want her to have 9 A's. Because Anna thought that only 9 A's would provide the guarantee of some kind of positive future for her daughter. And so the point was that I made little gestures in terms of buying Lisa's brother a guitar case. So I gave him an old guitar, and then he said he didn't want to take it anywhere because his mum said, "You might damage it, and it belongs to Howard." And I said, "Well, bugger it, you can have the guitar." And then I went to a second-hand shop and spent £3 on a guitar case. And then Shane could take his guitar to school and join in the music lessons. So little things like that, you suddenly realize how disadvantage and exclusion clusters in really insidious, horrible ways. It is concentrated in communities. In my country, in the areas where I live, there are whole small communities where employment is the exception, not the rule. And I suppose the most critical thing that probably has not affected you yet, I may be getting this wrong, because I know there's 2 countries in Norway. I know there's Norway and I know there's Oslo. You probably know the joke. I kept hearing it about this doctor who'd been from Pakistan, who'd come in the 1960s in the first wave of immigration, and he practiced as a doctor in Oslo for many years. Then he moved to Buda, and people didn't like him. People sort of appeared to be prejudiced against him, and he thought it was because he was Pakistani. And then somebody said, "No, it's because you're from Oslo." So there is an issue about the transmission. The Lisa and Shane's story I've just told you was special because there were 2 parents whose lives had been grim and miserable who had a gritty desire, prayer, that their children would not have to live the lives that they'd had to live. But in many other communities, the parents live lifestyles of unemployment, alcohol misuse, domestic violence, which is reproduced by the next generation, whose role models are those very forms of behavior. So these are young people who, in context of social exclusion, who are really on the margins. And again, I don't want to labor this point about youth transitions. This is academic stuff. For the last 15 years, there's been a lot of academic literature, largely in the English language, but also in German and Slovene and Danish, which points to the protracted nature of youth transitions, the changing nature of youth transitions, which, in outcome, have produced a growing division between the haves and the have-nots. And paradoxically, in liberal democratic societies where we believe in offering choice to young people, the already included choose more that will benefit their inclusion, and the already excluded, partly or significantly excluded, still do not take up the opportunities that we might make available. So the vulnerability and risk attached to some groups of young people in our modern societies gets compounded, gets worse. Raises, and I'll come to it a bit later, but raises a very tricky issue for you lot in terms of principles of detached youth work and any other form of youth work and any other form of kind of opportunity about voluntarism versus compulsion. And very, very controversial stuff, which I'll ask you to ponder over. I just want to mention, because I think it's another thing that's affected my particular journey through life and my particular set of commitments. I coined this horrible term status zero in 1993, and the British government didn't like it at all. So in 1996, they coined the term NEET, not in employment, education or training, which I don't know whether you use it, you probably don't, but the Japanese certainly do, and the South Koreans and the Romanians and the South Africans, and I detest the term. But I coined it as a metaphor for young people who counted for nothing. And I had done this study of the Milltown boys, who are 50 years old this year, 2010, all born in 1960. I met them in 1973 when they were 13-year-old little toe-rag delinquents who dropped out of school and were hanging around the street and pissing people off. And I got to know them. I did some participant observation with them on the streets when they were between 15 and 18 years old, and I was about 21. And I've studied them ever since, and the last book I wrote about them was when they were 40. And the issue about them is that they were a group of young people who, in the British context, were the first victims of economic change. They had expected to get the kind of jobs their dads and their older brothers and their uncles did in labouring work, in breweries, paper mills, steelworks, things like that. And all those things were closing down in the mid to late 1970s. So these kids suddenly were up the creek without a paddle. No education qualifications, fairly robust criminal records. And I wondered, when I followed them through, I sort of was always curious about what had happened to them, because there is a good news story. A good news story that, if it was true for all these kids, wouldn't need people like you. Because despite all the disadvantages they faced, about a third of them pulled through and have done okay. And when I talk to their kids, who are now adults themselves, some of them, those kids, some of them probably have no real understanding about the childhood that their fathers had had. So they found their way through without the need for professional and public intervention. But on the other side of the fence is a terrible, tragic story of individuals who have never done one single day's work in their lives, legal work. A story of people who have experienced years and years of short-term prison sentences. Not life sentences, but sentences of 18 months, 21 months, 36 months, 9 months, 3 months, shoplifting, fighting, those sorts of things. A group of people who have suffered disproportionately from mental health and alcohol problems and other drug-related problems. A group of people whose personal relationships were chaotic and catastrophic, which meant that though they produced the greatest number of children relative to some of the other subgroups, they often lost contact with those children pretty quickly and have had limited contact with them ever since. So it's a grim story, and it's one of the reasons why I was very eager to try and work, particularly with Blair and his lot, to try to develop stronger policy measures for socially excluded young people and socially excluded young adults. But what we are learning 13 years on is that despite this massive array of policy measures, the group of young people that we're talking about have remained stubbornly the same in terms of percentages, about 15 to 20% of the youth population. And that raises some tough questions for us as professionals. Why have we been so ineffective in making a difference to the lives of the kids that we believe deserve our support and which public policy tells us should be receiving our support? Okay. Now, I'm not going to talk about this in detail. This is a slide. You can see it's very neat and tidy. I didn't do it. I did a scraggy one, handwritten with overhead projector pens. And then the British government launched something called the Children and Young People's Unit in the year 2000. And I was asked to speak at it by a senior civil servant. And I said, "Why have you asked me?" And he said, "Well, a particular government minister wanted you to speak." And I said, "You wouldn't have chosen me." He said, "Definitely not." So he sent me a program, and I was down for 20 minutes to talk about social exclusion of young people. And then he rang me up and he said, "I want a copy of your speech so we can look it through." And I said, "I don't write speeches." And then I got another copy of the program, and I was down to 10 minutes. So I said, "Right, I'm not coming." Not in a big sulk, but simply I wasn't prepared to spend 5 hours on the train to go and talk for 10 minutes at some razzmatazzy political launch with 5 other government ministers, including good old Gordon, who was there right at the beginning. And so I said, "I want half an hour." They said, "No chance." I said, "All right, I'm not coming." I got half an hour. But then I said, "I've only got one slide," and I sent them my overhead projector transparency, which, of course, they didn't have the facility, they didn't have the, they all moved on by then. So this is a British government slide. Thank you, British government. And it really asks 6 questions. I developed this in the 90s, and I've tried it in lots of countries, in lots of places, about lots of issues, and at different kinds of levels. And people tell me it's quite helpful, so I always sort of chuck it into these lectures at some point. It's got 4 research questions and 2 policy questions. The first research question is, how big is this box that we're talking about? In other words, what's the size of the population of young people, or it could be for older people as well, but our focus is on young people. What's the population? Is it massive? Is it significant? Or is it insignificant, residual? I mean, in South Wales, some years ago, we had a sudden scare. The police and the health authorities and the schools are saying there's a massive upsurge in young teenage injecting heroin use. So I did a little bit of kind of exploring and discovered that there's one 13-year-old girl in Barry on the South Wales coast who had presented to about 25 different drugs agencies. Okay? So it wasn't a big problem. It was just that 25 different drugs agencies were reporting this issue. So we've got to be quite circumspect about managing the numbers. But the numbers are what, make the world go round in terms of the media and the way the political reactions and so on. So the first question is, are we talking about significant numbers? And of course, in some of your small communities, you're probably talking about very, very small numbers of young people. That doesn't mean that you should write them off, but it means that you have to think how you present that. The second research question is, how do you differentiate within the box? And I think this is absolutely crucial. I have spent my life listening to idiots talking about all young people do this or all young people do that. We know this is not true. And we know that the same symptoms, whether that's standing around on a street corner smoking a spliff, derive from different circumstances. So we've got to think quite carefully about how we choose, because we can cut into this box in many ways, how we choose to slice into the box, to think about appropriate responses. To give you a simple, quick illustration, I used to advise the Parliamentary Education Committee a long time ago, in the 90s, and we were talking about this stuff at one point, and the chair, an MP, Member of Parliament, said to me, well, what's your view? Took me by surprise, and I thought about my youth work practice. And I said, well, the kind of excluded kids that I deal with fall into three groups. I said with great confidence and utter nervousness. I said, one is a kind of confused group, probably the majority of young people. They don't want to be hanging around on the street with nothing to do. They'd actually rather be doing something else. They've lost their way. They've lost direction. But they're not fundamentally hostile or alienated or switched off from the sort of offers that we would like them to take up. And the response needs to be a kind of cajoling, nudging sort of response. Then there's a group in the middle, I reckon quite a small group, but significant, what I call the temporarily sidetracked. My mum's ill. That's why I'm not going to school. I'm looking after my mum, or I'm looking after my little brother, or my nan's ill, or whatever it is. But something is getting in the way of them staying on the main drag, staying on this side. And they need a bit of understanding and patience, because again, they're not fundamentally switched off from what we're offering. And then there's a group that I call the deeply alienated, falling into purposeful and purposeless. In my country, talk to some kids in rough council estates, they say, what's the point of going to school? I can earn £200 a week, selling a few drugs on the street, stealing a few cars, turning my hand in the illegal and informal economies in some way. They've got what one said to me, a different way of living, mate. And then there's the purposeless, the ones that I once facetiously called the in-your-face diamond white grunters. Diamond white is a strong cider. And they're the ones who stand there going, what? And they're on their 10th bottle. And it's quite difficult to kind of have some kind of communication with them. But they're the purposeless. They've given up. They don't really care anymore. And that is the group that exercises the minds of politicians, and they are the group who are going to be the most difficult to engage with and persuade that what we have to offer on the main drag is worth thinking about again. Because many of them have stopped thinking about that offer of schooling and training and proper work and so on. So that's the second question. Third question is, how did they get there? And that raises a whole set of other questions about families and communities and schools and contact and abandonment of children sometimes when we should have been intervening in their lives much earlier. The fourth question is, what happens if they are in that box? What happens in their later lives? Politically, it's a crucial question. If we could prove to governments that every kid who ends up in that box, whatever that box is in terms of our conception, is going to be, well, probably if we said they're all going to be dead by the time they were 25, governments wouldn't care so much because they wouldn't cost anything anymore. But if we said they were all going to be ill and out of the labour market and involved in criminal behaviour and looked at the kind of lifetime costs of that outcome, then suddenly providing better support and intervention when they are in that box or before they get into that box starts to make powerful political and economic sense. And then the two policy questions are, how do we build barriers to stop young people or others slipping into that box? What kind of preventative early intervention measures do we need? And the final question is, how do we build bridges for those young people who have already slipped into the box? How do we give them a way back? Okay. Conscious of time, I'm thinking, just here's some thoughts about effective policy. And some of these may be unhelpful for Norway right now, but might be helpful for you in 3 or 4 years' time if you start to move in some of the negative directions that my society has moved in. The most critical thing is reaching the right young people. And we, in British society, the pressure to deliver positive outcomes quickly to large numbers of young people mean that many organizations and individuals who are charged with trying to support the most disadvantaged young people go for the easy choices. They go for the essentially confused. They don't go for the deeply alienated. It's what, the third bullet point here, it's what a friend of mine who runs Turning Point, the drugs agency in London, and used to run Centrepoint, the homelessness charity in London, he once called it hitting the target but missing the point, which I think is a great phrase for capturing how it's quite easy to reach certain kinds of governmental targets if you're in a target-based culture, but actually not doing what you were meant to be doing. And that is the perverse behavior that if you have the wrong kinds of targets, the wrong kinds of pressures on organizations and professionals, then two things happen. Those organizations and professionals don't deliver and their funding gets stopped, or in order to survive, those organizations and professionals engage in behavior that secures their funding certainty but doesn't do the job that the funders think they're paying for. I don't need to dwell on the other points on this slide, but in that fancy government thing that I put up a bit earlier, I remember the very last words that I used in that speech in year 2000 was, and I looked at the government minister who was chairing me speaking, and I said, politicians and funders have to learn the art of patience. That sadly, we live in a world where expectations are accelerated all the time. It's been called by one of Tony Blair's former speechwriters the tyranny of policy momentum. Everything gets faster and faster and faster. And you get a paper chase. I once said to some senior guy in Brussels, Tom, it doesn't make any difference. We're not talking about real work with real young people. We're talking about the paper chase. People get European funding by writing something that says, we will turn the lives around of 200 young people, we'll get them all back into learning within 2 months. And then somebody sees 2 months, oh, we better say 1.5 months. And then we better say 1 month. And then, of course, and we'll do it cheaper. So you'll do more for less, quicker. And then you don't do more for less, quicker, and then you're deemed to have failed. But actually, my argument with Brussels was that what they actually did, given the resources they were finally given, because the Commission had chopped their funding by 25%, and it had only arrived, the money had only arrived 6 months after it had been planned to arrive. My point was that they had actually done quite a decent job. So we've got to, I don't know where Norway is in that kind of management, funding, organizational process, but I know that there is great disquiet in the United Kingdom and indeed in many other European countries about target-driven cultures that produce the wrong kinds of effects. Because of time, I'm not going to talk about extending entitlement in any detail. I just want you to think of a philosophy, really. Extending entitlement, until very recently, was the flagship youth policy for Wales. It's lasted for 10 years. It was approved unanimously by the Welsh Assembly government by 59 votes to 0 in November 2000. It is a completely different way of thinking about policies for young people from those that had prevailed in London between 1997 and 2000. I'd sat in committee after committee after committee in London which looked at yobby 14-year-olds, teenage pregnancy, drug-using teenagers, young offenders, antisocial behavior amongst young people, all these pathologies. And in 1999, when the Welsh government was set up, the first minister, the first secretary, put together a little committee, and I was a member, and I was the only one who'd been in London. So I said, let's not talk about yobby 14-year-olds. Let's talk about sorted out 24-year-olds. What is the framework of opportunity and experience that they've had, and you can look at that list, that they've had that have turned them into, engaged, civically conscious and responsible, labour market ready types of individuals. And no longer is it just family and education, it's much more. And so we came up with a list, and I remember flying into Oslo once, probably in the early 2000s, and my plane was very late, and I got a taxi to wherever I was going, and I had to go straight in and do the talk. And I just said, so that I can catch my breath, I told them this thing about extending entitlement, and I said, just sit quietly for 5 minutes and write down 6, 7, 8, or 9 things that you believe you had, so that you're sitting here today and you're not in prison. And broadly, we would agree on the same package, what I call the package of opportunities and entitlements, broadly. And then when we think about the young people that I was talking about earlier and that you engage with, the likelihood of them accessing that package of opportunities through private means, through personal motivation, through family support, through school intervention, is relatively slim compared to other kids. So the question is, how do we reach those young people and cajole them into accessing a broader package of that? I mean, one of the Milltown boys, who's a professional shoplifter, never worked, I don't think he's had a day's legitimate work since he was 21 or 22, and he's 50 now. His oldest daughter, who's just turned 18, he once took me up to her bedroom, and it looked to me like an advertisement for the Early Learning Centre. It had every pink gadget you could see, DVDs and a little computer for little children and lots of dolls. It was absolutely magnificent, all purchased on the proceeds of shoplifting. And he said, she will not do without. But he had never read her a story. He didn't know how to. And I wrote once that people like him equip their children with the gadgetry of competence. She's got a computer, that will make her clever. Well, it won't. And so one of the issues is about how do we actually extend that offer to level the playing field rather than to increase the youth divide. So I'm not going to go into that. And so we come back to you and the professional work that you do. Where does street-based youth work fit in? And can I don't want to, this is not about naming and shaming you, but how many of you know of the cycles of change kinds of theories? You will, do you? You better. You should do. Few, I can see 1 or 2 hands, there's a few. Yeah, this has been solidly kind of used within the addictions field for at least 20 years. Prochaska and Di Clementi are the kind of famous authors behind it. And it's simply about, it's more complicated than my simple explanation, but it's a cycle of pre-contemplation, contemplation, change, and relapse. It's actually about, I'm going down the shop to buy myself a packet of cigarettes and my heart starts hurting and I think, maybe I'll try and give up smoking. But it's a kind of maybe. And then something else happens, and then there's a more serious intent. And then there's, with support, change can take place, but many people, I feel a lot better now, I'll have another fag. Yeah, so they relapse. And funnily, in the UK, I was banging on about this cycles of change stuff to say it's relevant to education, it's relevant to prevention of youth offending, it's relevant to all sorts of things well beyond the addictions field. It's about, because one point is that you can say to a kid hanging around on the street 1,000,000 times if you're inclined, you shouldn't be hanging around on the street, you should be in education. But while they're not in a stage of contemplation, your words are going to fall on rocky ground, deaf ears. But many kids, in my experience as a youth worker, you can meet a group of young people on a street corner for 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, and, it's the summer and they're having a good time and it's quite nice, and then it gets a bit colder and they're getting bored and they're fed up and it's the same old stuff, and maybe they'd like to do something a bit different. Well, it's at that moment that the external intervention can kick in and be quite effective. So, and I think good street-based youth workers, the ones that Graham Tiffany talks about, are absolutely perfectly positioned to offer that first moment within the cycle of change. I do think that there's some issues about building purpose and engagement. Too often, in my view, detached youth workers kind of go for the quiet life. Maybe provocative to you lot, but to some of you anyway. But you you work on the agendas of young people and you live with the agendas of young people, and there's not enough kind of dialogical intervention that says, come on, you can do a bit more than that. I was in Malta last year and I was chatting to some politician who said, I need a shorthand for all this sort of fancy words that you're using, and I said, well, my youth work practice has been modelled on a very simple philosophy: an arm round the shoulder and a kick up the arse. And it is actually saying, I love you, give it a whirl, try it out, have a go. And sometimes the kick up the arse is something that we back away from a little bit. We're not quite sure whether we should be doing that. Did you have your hand there? Was that for me? Absolutely, timing. Yeah. So you've got to pick your moment. Well, that's the cycle of change issue. That if you kick, yes, absolutely. So you've got to demonstrate that your commitment, your concern, and your offer of support and response and listening. But you build the relationship. The moment comes. There always comes a moment. You don't wait forever for something to happen. You can start to nurture that and orchestrate that if you do it professionally. So, timing is absolutely crucial. And my fourth point here is about realistic destinations. Policymakers somehow think that street-based youth workers more generally, have some kind of magic wand. There's a kind of paradox in political perspectives on youth work. One is they're a waste of time, they can't do anything. They're not the kind of hard professional stuff. One of our ministers in the late 90s referred to the English Youth Service as the can't do, won't do service, and nearly scrapped it. He happened to be my member of parliament, so he was a Welsh member of parliament talking about the English Youth Service. And when he made that speech, I went round to his house, knocked on the door and said, hang on a minute, where'd you get that from? And he said one of his mates in the pub had told him that youth workers were always saying, don't go on that training scheme, it's a waste of time, don't do that, don't engage with these professionals. One conversation in the pub nearly led to a political decision to abolish local authority youth work in England. Quite incredible. But on the other hand, because youth workers claim that they have special relationships with young people, politicians say, okay, if you've got this special relationship, get on with it. Get them back into training, get them out of drug use, get them out of crime. And, of course, you're not in a position to do that anyway. And So finally, and this is the thorny stuff, there's the issue about making the connections. Connections is a buzzy word, not just because there's a policy in England about it, about supporting young people, but making the connections between police, social welfare systems, child welfare systems, health systems, community safety kind of issues. There's increasingly this notion of partnership. It's not new. It's been around for a long time. I did a study in the 70s on a local community-based partnership initiative and tried to reveal all the tensions that are attached to that about confidentiality, about information sharing, so on and so forth. But street-based youth workers, probably even worse than the rest of youth workers in my country, are often perceived to be unwilling to engage and explain their contribution to a broader collective professional effort. It's difficult. Young people on the street are going to be less trustworthy, less confident in street-based workers if they even just see them. And, I mean, you know, the classic story is the street-based worker build up a good link with a group of young people in the street, and then they sit around at interagency meetings. The local police officer comes along. All right, Dave, how are you? Well, the kids kind of think, well, you know, is he in the pocket of the police? What's going on here? And so there's a whole issue of managing relationships between, on the one hand, the young people you're working with, and relationships with the professionals on the other hand. This is about boundary maintenance. It's not a new issue. It's a long-standing issue. But I think that the kind of relatively privileged independent position of street-based workers that has prevailed often in the past, may still prevail in Norway, I don't know, certainly does not prevail in the UK. And I think Graham or Tony would have talked to you about David Crimmins and colleagues' work at the University of Luton about outreach street-based youth work, that increasingly there's pressures on them to come into the professional fold. So how do they do that and maintain the boundaries? Returning to the Norwegian Academic Journal article, they've got to kind of get beyond the romance and start to be a bit clearer about what their contribution is. I think if we think about a ladder of re-engagement, young people don't just re-engage like that. There is a ladder of re-engagement. Street-based youth workers are actually at the first rung of that ladder. I wrote an article a few weeks ago, actually. It wasn't about street-based youth work. It was about adult learning, vocation. It was about literacy and numeracy, and a project that I'm on the management committee of, I was mentioning it to Henning at breakfast, the City Centre Youth Project in Cardiff, had received some resources from the municipality to do some very, very, very first step kind of literacy numeracy things in and around the coffee bar within the project. These very, very suspicious young people were stepping through the door, coming and having a coffee, and there was just some kind of casual, tentative conversations about re-engaging with a kind of learning agenda around literacy and numeracy. And then, because they were not producing accredited outcomes, the funding was withdrawn. And I wrote an article called Why Ladders Have Rungs, which was really that these kids will never be able to lift their feet up to step onto rung number 2 unless rung number 1 is in place. You carry a big moral responsibility to provide that rung. Politically, of course, they should be supporting you in providing that rung. But the issue then is cajoling the timing, your point, absolutely right. But the kick up the arse bit is moving them on to rung number 2. And sometimes, and this is where youth workers shoot themselves in the foot time and time again with politicians, they sort of say, they allege to careers advisors, to vocational training providers, to community police officers, you don't understand these kids. We do. That may be half true, but it's half false. They have to understand these kids in a different kind of way from the way we do. So we've got to recognize that these young people will have to move to rung number 2 and rung number 3 if social inclusion is to be secured. Otherwise, we kind of trap them in a kind of socially excluded but mythical included position. Because while you're with them, at least they've got some attachment. So it's kind of the concluding remark is a bit of a hard message about moving young people on. I mentioned earlier in this talk status zero and NEET, not in education, employment or training. And recently, both in Wales and in England, there's been a resurgence of interest in the re-engagement of the NEETs. Now that's very difficult in hard economic times. But I've chaired a few national conferences because I say you start as a pioneer and you end up as a historian. And as I'm now the historian of NEET, I turn up to chair these things and remind people where it all came from. But very, very often, the majority of the audience are people from public professional services like yourselves who tend to subscribe and personally believe in a liberal democratic agenda. But many of those young people, the NEETs, live in environments where the only prospect of employment is some deferential, punctual time serving in a turkey plucking factory, where obedience is the order of the day. And sometimes I make that remark, and in the coffee break, I nearly get lynched by the people like you, saying I've sold out, I'm a traitor. And there's usually 3 or 4 people from private sector industry who've turned up to this event, and they come up to me and shake my hand and say, thank God somebody said that. Because we don't live in a utopian world, and one of our toughest personal ethical challenges is how far do we want to push these, and when do we push these young people to step 2, step 3, step 4 on a ladder towards a kind of existence that we wish they did not have to have. But it may be the better existence for them than the one of remaining in the box and in the prospective personal circumstances that people in that box are likely to face in the future. That's it. Thank you very much.